Hey guys, this is a tutorial to show you 3 ways that you can add a shadow to your image in Photoshop. So what the shadow does is basically makes your image look like it's not floating on the air, it's actually in the air, it's actually attached or on the ground. So the first one I'll show you is how to add like a basic shadow directly underneath, just to give make the item feel more solid. There's also how to create a long shadow either in front or behind your image, and also finally just a really quick way to add a simple reflection so that it looks like you've shot your image on a reflective surface. So let's dive straight in. Okay, so before we dive in and start creating shadows, let's talk about the quality of shadows and what is like what they're made up of. So in this image here, you can see it's they're all very hard shadows. So there's no cloud cover, and so you've got these hard edge shadows. Now, I think the mistake that a lot of people make when they make their shadows is they just make them black. But if you have a look, you can see really clearly in this image that the shadow actually has the colors of whatever it is that it's been created by reflected in it. So this shadow actually has some orange and some yellow in it, and it's also picked up a lot of the color from the sand. So this is not a black shadow. It's comprised of a lot of other colors. The other thing you'll notice with shadows is it's not one solid hard edge. If you go right in, let's see how far in I can get, you can see that around the edges, the shadows start to get soft. So, and like you can clearly see in this image that there is even some bluey green in here in the shadow. It's all different colors. Under the closer the shadow is to the thing that's creating the shadow, the harder the edge. So you can see right where the girl's foot is on the ground, you can see that the shadow is quite hard, and then there's also some green fringing in there. So the way to create the shadows then is to actually make multiple layers is going to give you the most convincing looking shadow. You can see in this image here, this is a soft shadow, and this is caused by window light coming in from camera left. And you can see that in this shadow, it's actually looks like multiple shadows. So you've got your main part of the shadow, and then it feathers out and goes a bit softer. So the softer the light source that you're using, the softer the shadow. And again, you're going to see that where it's close to what's causing it to create shadow, it's darker. And where it's further away, so the model's head here is tilted further towards camera, and so the shadow that it's making against the wall is a much lighter color compared to where his body is touching the wall here in the middle. The science of shadows. And you can see here in this image, the further away the item is that's creating the shadow, the more variation you're going to get in the tone. So these sticks from the pergola that are above the sand here now have the shadow feathers out. So you've got dark in the middle and lighter on the outside. Whereas this hammock here, the hammock is close to the sand. So the closer the item is to the wall or whatever's it's casting the shadow on, the harder the edge of the shadow is going to be. So you can see here there's quite a hard edge shadow, but again you've also got some softness around it. So there's it looks like there's a couple of different shades. So that's the the breakdown of the science behind a shadow. All right, now in order to create a shadow, a realistic shadow onto your a model or you might have a product, you need to isolate the product that you want to create a shadow for from its background. So you can see I've got my model and the background are separate. So there are lots of tutorials on that you can find in the community. It's just a matter of slogging it out and learning this. The learning is in the doing. It is frustrating at the start, but Photoshop has made it so much easier to cut things out. So worth knowing how to do, and hopefully when you get busy enough, this is the sort of thing you can farm out. There's plenty of places that will do it very cheaply, cutting out items for you. All right, so I've got my model there isolated from the background, and my background there is separate. Now what I want to do is create a realistic shadow. So this here model has been completely isolated, so he doesn't have any shadows, and what happens is he kind of looks like he's floating. I've created quite a large mask here so that I can show you the various different shadows. So he's pretty much floating in midair. We need something to anchor him, and if I show you what the original shadows look like, these are the real shadows caused by lighting. You can see that once they're there under his feet, he's anchored and he looks like he's standing in place. Now if you're doing a composite and you don't have those shadows, your person or thing is always going to look like it's floating. So that's what we're going to do first, is just create realistic shadows to anchor something in place. And the way I do that is underneath my background, so in between my model and my background, that's where I want to create the shadows. I need to create a new empty layer, so it's this icon here. All right, so now I have an empty layer between my model and my background, and it's on that I'm going to create some hopefully realistic looking shadows. Now there's a million different ways to do this. I think the easiest way is on an empty layer, I'm just going to create some shapes that I think look like men's shoes, and so you could also do that and replicate a shape that looks like whatever person you're trying to anchor or thing. But for this exercise, I'm going to create some shapes that look like men's shoes underneath my model. So the nature of the shadow is that, like, where it's closest to the ground where he's standing, that's going to be darker, and the further away it gets from the ground, it needs to be lighter. And so the way I do that is to create a number of layers to do that. And so I'm going to do that on an empty layer and create a circle. And it doesn't matter where I create it because it's on its own layer, so I'll be able to move it around. So I've come up to my brush preset, and what I want is a fairly hard brush. I want it to have somewhat of a hard edge, not completely hard, but somewhat hard to replicate the edge of a shadow. So I'm going to try about maybe 15% hardness. I'm going to have my opacity set to 100%, flow to 80%, and mode is normal. And so just here next to my model here, I'm going to create like a couple of clicks, and I've got a dot there, which not all that exciting. But if I come up to here and press the select button, Command T will do the same thing. I can now move that around. So I've got this little shadow that's under him. Now, at the moment, it's not really doing a lot. I can make it bigger, and that kind of works, but it's not in the right perspective. So what I want to do is change the perspective, and I'll show you how to do that. So I can just come down to Edit, Transform, and I'm going to hit Distort. Okay, and now I can distort it so that it's kind of in the right perspective that matches the ground there. Okay, now if you had a room or the original room or set still as a background, then all you need to do is follow that, the lines of that, when you're doing the distortion. All right, so I'll show you how that looks now. So I've got my brush selected, relatively hard brush. So we'll go 10% hardness, mode normal, opacity 100, flow is, might just bring the flow up to 80 there. All right, so I've got my brush tool selected. What I need to do is now just select the right color again. So I'm going to go to the darkest point here in the shadow and select that, so you can see that it's taking on some of the brown tones. Select OK, so that's now my foreground color. Have my brush. I'm going to create a new empty layer. All right, and I'm just going to, anywhere in the empty layer, just create a little dot. I'll do 2. Okay, so now I've got that transform hit, or Command T will do the same thing. And I'm going to go to Edit and Transform and Distort. Now, to make my life easier, if I have my background loaded into this file, so all I've done is the background that I shot everyone on. Let me just hit OK there. I'm going to turn that on, and so that's in the background. So basically that could be the studio set that you use, what you cut your person out of. That's going to have all the lines and the floor and a wall, or everything that you need to be able to work out your perspective. So now that I've got that as a guide, I can now go back to Transform and Distort, and now all I need to do is move these lines to match my area. So I just want to even copy it exactly. So if I put all the points to exactly where they are, that's, you can see now that my little circle shadow is now in the same perspective as the floor I originally shot it on. So that's going to be a big help. And now I can take that, I can get rid of this now, I can get rid of the floor. Now I can take this shadow, which is huge, way too big, and I can make it much smaller in size and bring it up and under. And what I'm going to do is, rather than have it one shadow to be for both shoes, I'm going to make little shadows for each shoe. Okay, so I'm going to create one for the front here underneath. Just stretch that out, and that's going to be my soft shadow. And then I can duplicate that. I'll hit OK. So Command J, that duplicates that, and I can bring it across and have it underneath here. I can stretch it out. All right, so that's the shadow for my other shoe. And you can see it's got the nice soft edge. And now I need one. So I'll come back to my original and copy that, Command J. All right, so I've got that shadow selected. I'm going to put another little one behind him and maybe just squish it in so that it's just under there. And Command J, and make sure I've got the right one selected, move it over, and I've got another little one under there. All right, so to make a slightly harder shadow, I've got my new empty layer selected, brush tool selected. I'm going to bring I'll have a brush hardness of maybe 50%, and opacity 100 and flow, I'll bring that maybe down to 90. All right, so I'll just increase the size of my dot. So again, I'm creating a circle on an empty layer. So there it is, and choose the move tool so I can now move that around wherever I want. So you can see now it's a slightly harder shadow that I've created, and again it's not black. I've used the same color as the darkest shadow on the inside of the shoe, so that's where I've made my color selection. So I'm going to, and again if I wanted to, I could turn on my background layer and just free transform that. So transform, distort, to get my perspective right. So basically what I'm doing is I'm just grabbing onto those little handles and pulling them out to be in line with the floor there. All right, so, and actually it's best to do it to an edge. And so now and I can do the whole size of the floor. So now my circle is exactly the right perspective for the floor, and it's okay, but it's too big. So once I've made that selection, I can grab onto those handles, and holding the shift key at the same time, I can make my little shoe shadow as large or small as I want. So I'm just going to move that there under my foot. I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller, and I just need to rotate it a little bit, bring it under here, push it in a bit. I'll actually have it for this. Bring it out. And I'm bringing the shadow right up close to the shoe, because as we know, that shadow's being created because the shoe is right up close to the ground, and where it's further away, it gets softer. Hopefully that makes sense. So that's one. And Command J, and I'll move that over, just rotate it around, and if it's not right, I just hit distort and just move it around so that it looks right in terms of perspective. Let's bring it out a little bit. Let's make that point a little bit longer. All right, so, and hit OK. There's before, there's after. I think that looks a lot more realistic now as just a very basic under the foot shadow. And to finish that off, so what I'm going to do now is just select all the layers that are shadow only. So I've got those selected, right click, and I'm going to merge those layers. And what that does is gives me one layer that is shadows. And the missing link for me is to just add a bit of noise. So I'm just going to add noise. Let's go into there. That's too much, because where there isn't light in photography, there's always noise. That should be on a t-shirt. So about I think that looks about right. So let's have a look. No, let's do more. Too much. Let's go to 10. 5. 5 looks about. Go to 4. Yep, 4 is about right. So you can see in there in the shadow, before, after. I think that's looking pretty good. Fairly convincing shadow. You can go next level now with this if you want to, and you can do something like add a layer mask. Click on that, go to the gradient tool, select the radial gradient, which is up on the top, which is just gives you a circular gradient. Click on the marquee and make sure that you've got this middle one here selected, which goes from, let me see if I can bring it up. It goes from black to nothing. So what this does is just gives you a gradient in the shadow. So it'll just basically soften the edges of that. So with this clicked on and my gradient tool clicked, I can come in here into my shadows and try that, and that just softens the whole thing. So basically it goes out from the center to the edges so that you've got like a nice, very soft shadow now, much softer than what I had before, but the edges are sort of fan out a lot better. And then I can duplicate those to basically get them as dark as I want. And if you want to go next level, you can increase the size of some and bring them out and just overlap them so you get the nice edge of shadows. Okay, and then do the bottom one much bigger than everyone else. And so now we've got this shadow that's got those multiple edges there that you see in a lot of other shadows. And then I think you'll never not overlook a shadow again when you see one. You realise how much work is involved. Okay, so just tweaking now size, and I think that's looking okay. And that's let me just take the background off. So that's the shadow there under him so that he looks like he's flat on the ground. All right, so the next thing I want to do is create a shadow that looks like it's trailing off behind him on the ground or directly in front, which is looks like a shadow that it's coming from maybe a harder light source. So what you need is to have again your model isolated from the background. So we've got that there, and then I'm going to now make a copy of that cutout. So what I do is hit Command and click in the center of that icon there, and you can see the marching ants. I've now selected that area, and I can hit Command J, and I've now got a duplicate. So I've got two versions of the model. So what I can do, I'll just reselect that, is with the selection active now, what I want to do is fill that and make it a shadow. So as I was saying earlier, I think the mistake a lot of people make is they'll just automatically fill that with black, and that you'll get a shadow that is probably the wrong color, and it doesn't have any of the subtle tonal variations that you get in a real shadow. So what I'm going to do is make sure that I've got the right color selected. So again, I'm going to go into the darkest part of this image, which I think is probably we can come up here into the blues. Maybe that'll give us more of a blue shadow. So into the darkest part of the suit. All right, and so that you can see in the color selector there that it's kind of going in the purpley blue area. Where else could I go? If I go in there, that's more of a blue black. So I think I'll go with that. I'll go with a blue black shadow. I like that idea. So, and then once I've got my selection there and my foreground color is now a blue black, it's not black, which would be down here. It does have some blue tones in it. I'm going to go to Edit, Fill, and Foreground Color, which is the color that I just selected, and press OK. And now you can see the blue tinge. I've got a blue shadow that is exactly my model, but it's in front of him. So what I'm going to do now is Command D or Edit Deselect, and now I'm going to take my layer, because it obviously a shadow needs to be under my model, and so what I'm doing is just clicking on that layer and moving it underneath. So if I move, just use my move tool, I can see that that's the shadow there behind him. All right, and I can move that across. Right, so there it is. Now that's not looking too bad, but again, it's a hard edge, and it's maybe you don't want the shadow on the wall next to him, you maybe want it on the ground. So we're going to do the same thing and create some sort of perspective shift so that the shadow looks okay. So all right, so I've got my shadow selected. I'm going to go to Edit, Transform, and Distort, and just pick up the shadow from that little handle there in the middle, and I can just flip it back, and still holding on to that, I can bring it in front if I want. I can have it to the side. I can have it coming up behind him, basically wherever I want. So I'm going to have it slightly behind him and a kind of a long shadow, and then it's just a matter of tweaking these little planes here and putting it, making sure that it's sitting under his feet. All right, and I can stretch it out a little bit longer. So that's like a long afternoon kind of shadow. Now, doesn't look all that fantastic because obviously it's still too dark, and it doesn't have that edge detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename that shadow 1, and I'm going to copy that, so Command J, and I'm going to rename that shadow 2. All right, so I'll turn off shadow 2. And what I'm going to do with shadow 1 is I just want to make this a bit softer, and also give it a little bit of more of a shadow look. So first of all, I'm going to reduce the opacity, maybe by about to about 50. Okay, and also I'm going to give it a little bit of blur, so filter blur, Gaussian blur, and we'll give it like a couple of pixels so you can see the edge detail there. which is a bit more realistic because no shadow is really going to be a super hard edge. All right, and particularly that it's obvious that he's lit by soft light because there's nothing around him that looks particularly hard on his face. All right, so I've got that. Now the next one, the shadow that's on top, I'm actually going to increase the size slightly. And this is going to give the edge detail that we need. Just move him along, hit OK. And now this one, I'm going to reduce the opacity a lot more. So this is just like pretty much going around, and you can see here, just if I can zoom in. Too many things on at once. So you can see that's what we're trying to create, that nice little edge detail of the shadow. So if I turn it off, that's what it is. All right, so now I can go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and give that slightly more. And so now we've got a kind of a softer edge to the shadow. And I'm just going to move that shadow down because suddenly it's moved around. All right, so it's starting to look a little more realistic, but you know, there are still issues with that. Now, so firstly, it's you've got to make sure that you take care of the shadows that are coming in front of his feet. So you can add a layer mask, or just get your eraser tool and remove that. And go to shadow 1 as well and just remove that. All right. So there's that. And the final piece in the puzzle is to make the shadow darker where it's closer to his body and fade away as it gets further away. And the way I do that is, I'm just going to turn that top one off, I'm going to add a layer mask. Make sure that the layer mask is selected. Then I'm going to come in here to the gradient tool. Make sure that my gradient is selected from dark to no pixels, and come in and you can see what happened there. Oh, actually, sorry, I'm just going to go, I've got the gradient set to the wrong the gradient needs to be linear and still dark to no pixels, and just come in. And you can play around with that, but you can see that now the shadow falls off nicely towards the end, and I can do the same with the other one and maybe start the gradient a bit further. Oh. So if you don't have the layer mask selected, that's what happens. So make sure you've got a layer mask selected, and so that it's only affecting the shadow. And you can play around with that, and you can also just tweak those gradients till you get something that looks a bit more realistic. So that's that, and then you can add a bit more, play around with the different settings. Actually don't like the gradient that I've got here. I'm going to do that again. delete layer mask, put a new one in. Sometimes this takes a couple of goes. Just going to start again now. That's better. It's a bit softer. All right, and then just maybe knock back the so that's that, and I might just blur that a little bit more. And give this one a bit more of a blur. And you've got a slightly softer shadow there. So that's that one. If you want to, you can also add the ground shadow. See that the ones that we did in the first place there under his feet. And so now it looks like there's a couple of light sources lighting him. And that just sort of places him more in the space a bit better. And the other thing that I like to do, just on a final note, is, so where is he? I'll just make another copy of that layer, and what I do is hit the select button, and basically all I do is just drop that straight down, and this is like a reflection that you might get when someone is on a shiny floor. Hit filter, blur, Gaussian blur, give it like, I don't know, 6 pixels, and then reduce the opacity to about 8%, and that actually gives quite a nice little polished look to an image. So it looks like kind of it's on a yeah, basically on a polished floor. Sometimes I also just get rid of a bit of the hue saturation, just desaturate slightly, just that the shadow, because it's not as the reflection, so it's not as saturated. And that's just another way that I finish off an image there. So that's a few ways you can use reflections and shadows and add those to your images in Photoshop. If you've got any questions or want to share some examples, please do. Thanks, guys.